Got my guest on, so let's go straight into it. Probably my error, but there you go. The book is called, and I've lost my notes on this precise moment, but delighted to be joining me live on the line to tell us all about When Russia Was a Democracy. It is indeed Kenneth MacInnes. Kenneth, good morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning.
It's one of those mornings. Right then, something that struck me, there is a history of democracy in Russia, although we may think that isn't happening because of the autocratic behavior of a certain leader.
Yes, there is actually a very, very long history of democracy. And that was one of the reasons why I wanted to write this book, to bring this to the forefront, because generally people tend to think of Russia as not a country of democracy. They think of Tsars, communism, Putin, and Russia's own leaders like to make it that way themselves, and as if to keep the people in the dark and not to bring to the forefront the tradition of democracy in Russia. But if you go over Russia's about, say, 1,000 or 1,500 year history, it's probably lived under democracy far more than it has under dictatorship.
Which is strange because, I've always thought of Russia pre-revolution as being basically feudal.
No, I wouldn't even call it feudalism. What happened was, before there was any Russian state at all, just when you had the East Slavic tribes, they had their own popular assemblies. They ruled themselves. And then when a state was formed that's in the second half of the 9th century, then these assemblies continued. Yes, they did start to have princes, mainly from the Scandinavians the Scandinavians who came to set up the first Russian state of Rus. But in some places, in most of the country, the princes, it was like a power sharing with these popular assemblies. And in certain parts of the country, such as Novgorod, these assemblies, the assembly was called the Dacha, and it comes from the same root as the modern word Soviet, meaning a council. In places like Novgorod, which was a republic, this assembly held sovereign power. And that really continued up until the end of the 15th century. So we're already talking about 1,000 years of self-government for at least parts of the country, and in other parts of the country sharing with the princes, and kind of democracy would implode. There'd be a battle between the prince and the people.
So Novgorod is interesting because that is one of the first, if you like, democratic republics then.
Yes, in fact, it's very much overlooked. Because in the Middle Ages, it was the largest republic and the largest democracy in the world. And again, this is maybe a little bit of Russia's leaders having. The thing was, Novgorod. It was defeated by the democratic government there, and the republic was overthrown by Moscow in the year 1478. And so then Moscow took over, and in Moscow, the prince was sovereign, the Grand Prince of Moscow. And so this developed into the Russian autocracy over the whole of the country. But as many Russian thinkers, for example, Alexander Herzen in the 19th century said, what would it have been if it had been the other way around and Novgorod had defeated Moscow?
Wow.
And then it would have been the Novgorod Republican system that might have held sway over the rest of Russia. There are many, many, many factors why that did not happen, but it's always interesting to.
That's one of the great what's ifs, because if that happens, then perhaps the Bolsheviks don't get back. If they don't send the Germans, if Germany doesn't exile a bunch of unwanted exiles back to Russia, then we don't get the Bolshevik Revolution, etc., etc. One of the things that struck me, and I didn't know as well before, because women got the vote in Russia before the UK, presumably.
Oh yes. It's happened because of the 1917 revolution, when immediately after the February Revolution, all women were given the vote. But even prior to that, in the first place in Europe, where women were allowed to vote, they were given the right to vote in 1906 in Finland, because Finland was part of the Russian Empire, but it had autonomy. And actually, even before that, in 1905, in Latvia, which was still part of the Russian Empire, women actually went to vote in local elections in 1905, and even in a breakaway republic in part of called the Gurian Republic in Georgia, which had broken away in 1902 and set up its own government, women were given equal rights right from the start there, and also just shortly before 1905.
You mentioned Finland in the same sentence there as Russia, and a lot of our Finnish listeners are probably throwing stuff at the radio even as we speak. Right then, let's move on then. You were over, because I mean it's criminal to do this, and I must apologise because you have to accordionize, if that's a word, the segment. And let's move on to the period that you were in Russia, which was fascinating. I remember I was a younger journalist in London when all hell broke loose, basically, in that period between Glasnost, Perestroika, the attempted coup, and then we have Yeltsin. Fascinating period, and you were there.
Yes, it was very, very interesting to observe. And that was mainly the reason why I wrote this book, because it was such a unique period, looking at it now as like a small island of democracy, freedom, anarchy, it has to be said, between these enormous oceans of communism leading up to the late 1980s, and now Putinism, which has been running on for 2.5 decades now. So it was a very unique period, and I wanted to chronicle some of the aspects of that period in this book, because they are maybe gone forever and no one had ever written their history before.
How close was Russia then to total anarchy? And Yeltsin is at the moment, because we are, in terms of historical writing, it's only the blink of an eye or a snap of a finger that we were there, in terms of actually, we haven't got a retrospective view. But Yeltsin is poked at as a figure of fun almost, who was permanently, shall we say, overtrained, perhaps a little bit inebriated. You have to be pretty astute to get to where he was. And at that moment where it looked like, as I said before, Russia was a nuclear superpower was about to descend into anarchy, the image of Yeltsin on a tank surely has to be reappraised and looked at. He wasn't a buffoon. He wasn't a clown. He may have been impaired by several reasons, but he was a sharp operator at some point.
Oh, yes, absolutely. He was a very astute politician. And on the one hand, while he himself had been a member of the Communist Party, being the regional governor for Sverdlovsk, now Yekaterinburg region, so he hadn't really grown up in that tradition, but he did, when Gorbachev brought in these reforms, he did enthusiastically support them, and he did seem to be a genuine Democrat. Margaret Thatcher noticed this when she was very much in love with Gorbachev, but when she first met Yeltsin in 1990, she saw that, yes, he seemed to have thought things through a bit more than Gorbachev, and she reported this to President Bush. Bush didn't agree. He wanted to stick with Gorbachev, but yes, and actually, funnily enough, there might even been a genetic link between Yeltsin and this Republic of Novgorod that we talked about, because when the Republic of Novgorod was overthrown in 1478 by Moscow, many of its citizens fled to the furthest reaches of the fallen Republic, and the Republic stretched as far as Siberia. And one fellow called Yelizarko Yelits went all the way to the Ural Mountains, and that was where he established himself, and he was the ancestor of this man called Boris Yeltsin. So it's almost like Boris Yeltsin with his Novgorodian roots was returning to restore democracy to Russia.
It's in the blood. And now we have a situation, and I interviewed journalist John Sweeney, who's currently in Kyiv, and I've interviewed Gavin Esler, who obviously writes about, he's described Putin's government as a kleptocracy, because they seem to...
Oh, yes.
Yeah, yes. Thank you. Well, the way that you just leapt in there, Kenny, with that one. We've seen, power, everybody knows power corrupts absolutely, and absolute power, as I say, corrupts even more absolutely. Why is Russia? Why are we where we are at the moment in the situation with Putin, and how long can this go on? And is this part? I mean, we would look at it as a tradition of it goes all the way back to the Tsars, which is a very facile way to write it off, Kenny.
Mm-hmm. Well, I found when writing my book, I found without really searching for it, that democracy begets democracy. And democracy always has to defend itself. In the course of Russian history, many times they've given power to a Tsar, or they've held power themselves after 1917, and they've just let others come along, like Romanov Tsars or the Bolsheviks, and take the power away simply because they weren't determined to stand up for it, even using the force of arms. And as you say, you just need. That was just one of the conclusions.
Is it a fact that perhaps a Western idea of democracy, or this may sound a bit strange, is a bit different to what democracy in Russia is, in terms of how we see democracy as being market-led? To be honest with you, it's a capitalist society, whereas true democracy has got nothing to do with the way the markets move. It's got to do with the will of the people.
Yes, well, democracy takes different forms in different countries. And to think that our Western democracy is the be-all and end-all is wrong, because also the book goes into about how actually Russian democracy has failed because it's let foreign influence, whether that be the Mongols, the Byzantine Empire, Marxism as a Western philosophy, or even the Western spin and the 1996 presidential elections, when they let the spin doctors take over. And so one of the kind of maybe lessons to take from the book is that each country has its own sovereign democracy, and it's best of all when it's sticking to that sovereign democracy, whatever shape or form that might take. Indeed,
and the whole idea of Marxism being a Russian thing. I mean, Marxism was never supposed to take off in Russia. It was supposed to be in Western democratic things. That's the great ironic thing, isn't it? That was supposed to happen in Berlin or in London or Paris, not Moscow. When it comes to writing something like this, how do you get a narrative? Because there's so much going on, and there are so many influences, and it's hardly a small sphere, to be honest with you, Kenny. Let's face it. I mean, when you're looking at books like that, you could, particularly the whole sweep from medieval republics to modern day Moscow. How do you keep that in the sort of any sort of legible order?
Well, it's very difficult. Originally, the book was planned really just to be about the 1990s and maybe have an introductory chapter on all the democracy that had gone before, such as Novgorod, the Imperial Duma, Constituent Assembly in 1917, 1918. But I just found that there was so much interesting information that's just not known or overlooked that it actually took over the book. So maybe a third to a half is about the 1990s, but all the other parts are just all these very interesting bits, not just the Republic of Novgorod, how people, small communities setting up their own republics at times of wars or invasions or civil war. So yeah, there really is a great deal of information. And the original book that I wrote was twice the size of the finished book. I just had to condense it all.
And one of the press notes says that, and why Putin has such a deep aversion to free ballots.
Well, of course, it's always affected his career because he was working for the KGB in Dresden, and then when they had in East Germany, when they had their democratic revolution in 1989, and then so he returned to Russia in 1990, and on 3 occasions when he'd taken part in elections, he'd led his party to failure, whether it was supporting the mayor Sobchak in St. Petersburg or when he was the electoral agent of the party of power in Nasz Dom Rossiya. It was called Our House is Russia in the mid 1990s. And then when he was the deputy mayor in St. Petersburg, the mayor Sobchak lost the election in 1996. And once again, that threw Putin out of a job. So he just does not like the unpredictability of elections.
Well, it's fascinating reading. The book is called When Russia Did Democracy. It's by Kenny MacInnes. Kenny, if people want to find you online, where can they track you down?
I've got a website, rusartnet.com, or you can visit the publisher's website, amberley.com.
And it will be available as a virtual download. Any man who has a Kandinsky as a background setting on his Zoom
thank you.
is
My private art collection.
Yeah, private art collection. Indeed. Well, there you go. Well, we took it here after the break then, in that case. This book is called When Russia Did Democracy. Fascinating reading. It will reveal more than you know, just to be digging behind the surface of Russia. The book is called When Russia Did Democracy. It's by Kenneth MacInnes. Kenny, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much. Nice to talk.